Thank you so much for all joining us. And I'm delighted that thanks to the wonders of this technology, although perhaps I won't speak all too soon, that you can join us here digitally, and we can all come together in these very strange times. And I'm especially thrilled to welcome Julia Samuel here for the event. I can't think of anyone better to navigate us through this uncertainty. She's one of Britain's leading psychotherapists, 3 decades of experience, both in the NHS and in private practice, and she's a specialist in the psychology of change and grief. And her most recent book, which I have here, obviously, of course, very wizened because I've been reading it so very carefully, and it's just, the title couldn't be more timely. It's a sentiment I think we all want to cling to in these times, which is, "This too shall pass, stories of change, crisis, and hopeful beginnings." And it's about conversations with her patients that show us how we can learn to adapt and to thrive during very difficult, or the most difficult and transformative experiences. But I am going to let her do as much of the talking during this next hour as possible. You've all come to hear from her, not from me. I'll be asking her questions for 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. I can see you all already interacting, but if I can ask you to hold your questions for the first 30 minutes and then to start asking them when I say, that would be much easier. And then I'll make sure I can try and get to them all. And I'm sorry if I don't. But thank you again for all being here. And Julia, thank you. I mentioned, obviously, it's the most uncannily timely of titles, but actually you wrote the book before Corona, before this situation, well before it was even contemplated. What motivated you to write it? And what did you want people to take away from it?
I mean, the main reason I wrote it was that the sort of unifying factor of all the clients from whatever background, whatever their presenting issue was that they had a problematic relationship with change. And then they felt that somehow they were doing it wrong, rather than recognizing that even change we want, and certainly change that we don't choose, we find it difficult. And we kind of think if we will ourselves to do it, or resist it, or tidy our feelings in a sort of Marie Kondo type box, then we'll do it perfectly. But actually, change is a messy, unpredictable, uncomfortable process, which the globe is experiencing right now.
You say, of course, as you said, it's a book about change, what we feel as we change. And you write, sudden or big change hits us as if a tiger has jumped out at us and sends fear cascading through our whole being. But why is that? And it's your question. If change is part of the natural order of things, it's something we absolutely can't avoid. Why do we all feel so badly equipped to deal with it? And why do we often face it with fear?
I mean, there are 2 sides to that. So the reason we respond as if there's a tiger jumping out at us is, from our evolutionary beginnings, we have a negative bias to look for danger. So when we feel safe and everything's familiar and we know what's going on, we feel very calm. But if there's something that's new and changing and unknown to us, our body goes on alert. And the bigger the change, the bigger the alert. But in the 21st century, there's a number of things that affect us. One is that we no longer have fight or flight in the way that we did. And we think that we can have a fast track app, that we can organize our feelings to match the events in our life, that our feelings take much longer to catch up than the events. But also, the fear is the signal of change, and all discomfort at one end and sort of real kind of discomfort at another end, or sort of pain at another end. It's the signal to tell us that this is something new, so that you have to adapt. And if we let the feelings come through our bodies and find ways of expressing them, then naturally we evolve and naturally change as we're wired to do. And the research is very irrefutable, is that those that resist and block change have less joy and less success in life. And also, when change comes again, which it inevitably will, they'll find it harder.
And I want to come back to so many of those points, and also, of course, how we deal with them, because I'm sure so many people are here to find out tools for dealing with them, and you have so many. But Can I just ask, in your personal experience, how it's working out? Obviously, many of your clients already suffer from anxiety and depression, and some people say that at this time it's almost better for people because who suffer from those things, because they suddenly see everyone is feeling the same sorts of feelings. Is that the case, or does it exacerbate those sorts of feelings?
I mean, to be honest, it's unique, and there's truth in all of what you said. So whatever change hits us, all of us will have our first wired response, our kind of default mode that we will go to. Some people get very busy, some people shut down, some people go to panic. And so everyone, when the lockdown came, will have their naturally wired response. For my clients, some of the clients who were really suffering, there was a strange kind of relief that they weren't alone with the suffering, that other people were suffering too, and that the world wasn't having a party when they felt they were kind of stuck inside and very depressed. But other people who already were anxious or had some levels of OCD are finding it really intense and really, really difficult. So what my message in the book is that none of us have this perfectly curated response to change, that our feelings run us. And that what we need to do is find ways of supporting us in it rather than resisting it. So that we each need to so in the book, through the case studies and the examples, there are lots of different ways that people have to create their own toolbox so that they manage themselves through the change for themselves.
And I said, that we're all in the same boat, and that's absolutely not the case. And I don't know whether there are other people. I think I certainly feel it. You feel certainly a bit guilty for feeling overwhelmed when other people are going through a much harder time than, for example, I speak from my own experience. And there is a sense of guilt that you say, you feel like this and overwhelmed and anxious, and yet you're not suffering as badly as others. But your message, I think, in the book is you must all have self-compassion and self-care. And
yeah, I think that's true. I mean, there are many things in what you're saying, which is that, guilt is there for a reason. It's to remind you to do the right thing if you think you're doing the wrong thing. But if you're having a feeling, that isn't either right or wrong. So don't confuse feeling with fact. Just because you feel guilty doesn't mean that you are guilty. So it's very important to kind of separate out the two. And also, as you said, the most important thing when we are in the process of change, or really through life, is our relationship with ourselves and our relationship with others. And we have to start with our relationship with ourselves. So we need to be self-compassionate. But the other thing is that when we feel most powerless, one of the things that actually is incredibly effective is helping other people, is reaching out and connecting with other people, which in this country hundreds of thousands have done, because not only do you begin to feel less powerless, but you are making a difference to someone else. They feel better, you feel better. And as a kind of extra bonus, your immune system is stronger when you help other people. So, I mean, that is a way of assuaging guilt. Although you can never talk yourself out of guilt. People think they can kind of talk themselves down, but they can't.
And you obviously have these, before this all started, many of your relationships with your clients was done digitally, and was done via Skype or remotely, obviously online.
Even Zoom. I was an early adopter on Zoom. Yeah.
An early adopter on Zoom, exactly. But this is something that I am thinking about a lot at the moment, whether digital contact can be a good enough substitute. I mean, you talk in the book, relationships are the most important thing, such an important theme throughout the book. People need people. And
great.
And well, your quotes, of course, and well-being and health are predicated on being close to the people we love. But if we're doing that digitally, does that compensate?
It's a lot better than nothing. So I think the fact that there's video now more than just audio, it can feel very intimate because you see someone's whole face on quite a big screen. So you can read that, we read faces. 80% of communication is nonverbal. So we pick up a lot from the screen. And actually, I think as we get more familiar with it, our sort of bandwidth of emotion connecting to it adapts and change. I think our system changes. I'm even noticing when I have Zoom kind of chats in the evening with friends, the four of us to begin with was a bit clunky and it felt a bit screeny. But now kind of 2 weeks later, we find a way of letting space for each other and, you know, feeling relaxed. And it doesn't feel so different from sitting across a table. So I think we do change with it.
And, you know, the other thing that seems very important is vulnerability. And I said we're all in the same boat. The idea that we are all feeling vulnerable. Do you think there's something that comes out of that we are all able to admit our own vulnerability in a way that we haven't been before? People seem more readily able to admit now we are a mess, we're not coping. And there's less sort of shame or stigma around that because everybody's suffering.
I think there is something very powerful about opening vulnerability and being able to express vulnerability, which is very different from sort of moaning and, you know, complaining online, because what you're doing is opening, you're not armoring yourself. And I think in a very kind of fast performing world, when you're out there pushing your business or yourself uphill, you have to kind of armor yourself to move forward. But of course, if you're going to connect with people, you need to be more open-hearted. You need to be able to feel more, to have greater connection with yourself. And then you transmit more and then you get greater connection back. So I think some people in some ways are having more in-depth conversations and closer intimacy than they did in their very fast-paced lives. And also, but one thing never knocks out the other. So I think people are having multiple experiences, that you can have deep connected conversations. You can be highly anxious. You can be fearful about the future. You know, we're a complex system as human beings. And I think often, particularly in books, there's this like 12 rules of life. You know, if you do this, then you'll get everything right. And I think really what I'm saying more is to the more aware of all the complexity that's going on inside you, and the more you're kind of self-compassionate with it, the more resilient you'll be in your openness and vulnerability. And that's what you want, is resilience.
Do you think that in some ways then there's a positive change that will come out of this, in the sense that we do have this time forced upon us to, you know, look at ourselves, to examine ourselves, to accept those things you're saying that we must do? Is there a sense that this time of isolation gives us more time for contemplation and more time to work out things in our head that we otherwise wouldn't want to address?
I mean, I think for lots of people, it will, you know, busyness is the most common anesthetic. It's the thing that stops you feeling. And so people can get very busy in four walls, by the way. I mean, you can, you know, be constantly online and Instagram. And so people cannot be doing that. But if they are using the time to explore themselves and have more open conversations and discover that actually, you know, always going to an office or always running may not be the answer to what they want in life. I mean, I think it's interesting. What I know and what we know from research is that there's this thing called post-traumatic growth. And that never negates the intensity of the trauma or the loss. So that is a given that happens, and this doesn't make that better. But what people find is that when they find they've survived and come through a really devastating traumatic experience, at the same time, they find that they have different aspects of themselves they never imagined that they would have, that they were more resilient, that they survived something they thought they would never survive, that what matters to them in life, like connection to others, making meaning, changes. And that feels like growth, and it's called post-traumatic growth. Whether we can universalize that, and that is an experience that will happen on a level of millions, I don't know. People, you know, like in my book, people resist change. So I think there will be some people who've really taken something from this and they'll learn something from it. But I think a lot of people will want to go back to the default and kind of go back to what's familiar. I mean, it's a very, very interesting kind of social experiment, but I think people will be studying for decades, actually.
It was exactly what I was going to move on to say, whether you feel it will last. There's a lot of talk about this profoundly changing society when, and hopefully in not the too distant future, we go back to some sort of normal. But I wonder if you think that we will be able to make those more positive changes last.
I wonder, I mean,
or will we bounce back?
The other message in my book is that these things take work, and they take commitment, and they take endurance, and they take decisions. So that if someone uses this time to discover aspects of themselves they didn't know were there, and this emerges, and they choose then to live their life according to that new discovery, that it will challenge them, but it takes commitment and endurance. But then they might find more meaning, and they might find more satisfaction. You know, what certainly we know is that meaning and connection to others is what makes a life that is happy, rather than seeking happiness. I mean, do you think you've learned anything? What will you take from it?
I mean, I have learned so much, but it's exactly, I think, the time to sit and to think, and probably some of the experiences have been quite emotional and quite troubling. And you see whether, I mean, as we were talking about earlier, and I think a lot of people suddenly, I'm not in isolation. I'm finding that I'm living with my family all together. And I know you speak about whether there are other people who are doing the same thing. You've spoken about the fact that that's a time when you really need to communicate with each other, to work out each day how things are working for you, and to have a little mini Cobra meeting, I think you say.
Yes. I mean, I think, you know, not seeing each other very much gives you an out, doesn't it? But when you're forced in lockdown to have every meal together, it exposes pre-existing fault lines. And also, if you're, say, with your parents, you revert back to the 8-year-old self, and they become their parental self. So the whole power dynamic is confusing and difficult, but also kind of wonderful in some ways, I guess. Yeah. And I suggest that every few days, if you're a group of you, I mean, we do this, and my daughter and her husband and their kids are with us. And so every 3 or 4 days, after breakfast, it's not very long, we have a kind of 10-minute Cobra meeting, and we sort out practical things like chores, like who's going to do lunch, what do we need to get, those things. But also we being the therapist, we have a stress test. So everybody, including my 7-year-old and 10-year-old grandson and 12-year-old granddaughter, they give themselves marks out of 10 of, you know, what they're liking, what they're not liking, and what they want more of. And then at the end of every day, they do this thing where one of them chooses a song that they all listen to, and then they do a 5-minute meditation, and they talk around the room, one gratitude each. And so I think one of the things that helps in this chaotic time is that we feel very chaotic internally. And so having a new structure that has a beginning and an end of the day, that is a ritual, that is like a bookend of your day, that is short and simple, but it's comforting and it's connecting, is a very good way of having balance and helping you manage.
You talk about a lot through the book, your self-help toolbox and self
my 8 pillars of strength.
Pillars of strength and self-soothing, and these are things that come up with so many of your clients. And of course, everyone has their own different ways of switching off, of relaxing, of trying to deal with these things. But perhaps you could tell us whether there are some, and I think you know some do come up again and again, similar ones that apply to everyone, and more general advice.
So they're in the 8 pillars, but if I was going to take my top pick of 5 that really helps, the first one. So I think one of the complicated things about self-help is that you want your self-help to be the sort of magic bullet that matches the enormity of the events that have happened to you, whether it's COVID or whether you've lost your job or your husband's walked out on you. And what we need to first acknowledge is that our feelings take weeks and months to catch up on the event, and that the habits we develop to support ourselves, given those feelings, are like the weather. They sweep in and crush you, you know, overwhelm you, and they sweep out again, and you don't have charge of that. If you develop habits that help bring your autonomic nervous system balance. So people often sort of shoot up to fourth gear. So I often talk about trying to get yourself down to kind of second gear. 3 or 4 things work like magic, completely consistently. One is exercise. So getting your heart rate up. It can be doing a 12-minute app in your sitting room. It can be doing a Pilates class online. It is better if you go outside. Being in nature helps. Being in the green helps, obviously in the spring, but winter, summer, going outside is better. If you combine that with any kind of breathing exercise, and this isn't about finding the Dalai Lama or your kind of inner arm. It's like after you've exercised, come back, and if you breathe in for 7 and out for 11 for 5 minutes, your system, the cortisol's already dropped because you've told your body you're not flying or fighting. You then breathe. So you tell your body, I'm not in danger, I'm calm. And then you give yourself a treat. So it could be a delicious cup of coffee if you're me, or it could be a delicious smoothie, or you play a nice piece of music, but you intentionally give yourself a treat. That's a cycle that calms your whole body, which means then you have more resilience when the wave of anxiety or fury or distress comes through your system. So exercise, meditation, finding some way of expressing how you feel. With some people, it might be journaling, and this isn't writing a George Eliot book. It's like getting down what you feel, so people's feelings, like people who are listening now, they'll be inchoate, there'll be messy feelings in their body. It's sort of putting your attention inside, focusing on what the feelings are, finding words to describe them and expressing them. And you can do that on paper. You can do it with a friend. You can do it with a therapist. You can do it with your sibling, your partner. So it's releasing it, because when we do that, we incrementally adjust to this new reality that we don't want. When we resist and hold it down, it stays tight inside us. All of us know that, and if you're really worried about stuff, if you don't tell anyone, it just stays there like a kind of tin of rubbish in your system. But when you actually let it out, you do feel better. Then intentionally doing things that comfort and soothe you. So for me, it would be watching funny films or, Modern Family. If I've had a stressful, difficult day, I'll watch 20 minutes of Modern Family. So if you think whatever you put into your system, what you listen to, what you watch, what you eat, who you see, all of that affects your mood. So if you're wanting to do something that's going to bring your mood to a kind of stable, feeling happy, content position, don't watch a horror film, if you see what I mean. But or it might be having flowers on your kitchen table, anything that kind of was a hot bath. Those things really help. And then the big one is connection to yourself and connection to other people. So kind of knowing what's inside you and finding ways to connect other people. So if you're living alone right now, connecting through tablets and phones is really important, really, really important, because as I said, that is what matters to us most in the end. When we look back on our lives, the thing that matters to us most is a love and connection to other people.
Yeah. And one of the things I know that people find very hard to deal with at the moment is a complete lack of control. We're in a place in life, in modern day life, where we're used to things largely being fixable. And you say in the book,
they're going to come and sort it out. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I know that you bring up a lot the serenity prayer, and it is incredibly helpful. So for those people who don't know that, perhaps you could explain that and your thinking behind it.
So it's from AA, the serenity prayer, but actually I think it's the perfect prayer for nowadays, which is to accept the things you cannot change, to change the things you can, and have the wisdom to know the difference. And so part of that, I think particularly people who are very driven and ambitious, and some of my clients are like this, they're fantastic, but they're used to willing and fighting their way through a difficulty. Everything they've faced in their life, they've got someone in to help them. They've chucked money at it. They're kind of thinking their way through this. Something like this, there's no thinking to be done. So the best thing you can do is keep it in the day. So have your mini structure, not like a police state structure, but your relaxed structure where you maybe do tasks in the morning, nice things in the afternoon, whatever it is for you. And don't project into the future, because the one thing is certain right now, that we don't know our future. And our imagination, what we don't know is much more frightening than the truth. And we can really send ourselves down a sort of technicolor nightmare of worrying about what our future can look like. Whereas when you know that you can deal with today, you know you can deal with making this next meal or talking to this friend, and that makes it much more manageable.
I think absolutely. I think obviously the greatest fear is the fear of not knowing, and no one knows what or if, when and how it will end. But you say obviously the most important thing is to try and live in the day intentionally for each moment.
But also, I mean, who are we kidding? We have never had control over the things that matter to us most. I mean, you know, I've spent 30 years working with people who are living with death and losses that they didn't expect. The thing that matters to us most, which is birth and death, we can influence, but fundamentally we have no control over it. And the same thing about what people think of us. Again, we can influence. If we're not a total bitch and we're perfectly nice, people will more likely warm to us. But they may not like us for reasons that are nothing to do with us. They may look like their teacher who they hated. So, I mean, we have no control over the things that matter to us most. And that has never changed.
And also, one of the things that runs through, and you're, again, to quote you, but why would I not?
I love being quoted.
Hope is the alchemy, you say, that can turn a life around. But that is hard, again, in these times, because you quite rightly point out what we don't want is false hope. And actually, I'm thinking about what our leaders should be telling us at
like
the moment.
Trump, we believe in his hope, don't we? America's going to be triumphant at the end of this.
I think it's a very interesting thing that they should be navigating this path between being honest with us and giving us hope. The danger of false hope is worse, I think you'd say.
Yes. So, I mean, there's a big difference between kind of shallow optimism and false hope. When I talk about hope as the alchemy that turns your life around, is that even, you know, when you're in the darkest pit, that hope is an emotion. But it isn't just an emotion that supports it, but it's also a plan, like what you would hope to have. So this goes against my future planning, but a rough plan of what you'd hope to have, a plan of how you would get there, and self-belief. And this wouldn't be something that you kind of concretely, completely commit to. But for hope, we have to have a kind of sketch of what we're hoping for. So for now, if someone's been furloughed, their hope will be that their business survives and that they can go back to their job and that they'll still be employed. And that's a realistic hope and one that's worth keeping. Whereas if they kind of go down the route, the business is going to go bust, I'm not going to have a job, I'm never going to get a job, they'll make their time that's already difficult much worse. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And it also brings up my possibly last point, sadly, because I'm going to have to turn to the many questions and I can see the screen going mad with comments, which is
good.
I
want to see I want to see everyone's faces, actually. I want to talk to everybody and everyone. But anyway.
Try that next time, a multiple Zoom. But you say that people being furloughed, and I think that that's one of the things that also is very hard for people to grasp. A lot of people, you talk in the book, one of your chapters is work, and you acknowledge that work is central to our lives these days. It gives us meaning and identity and a direction of travel for many people, a team. And now a lot of people have lost their way, that people who have lost their job for the moment have really lost a sense of purpose. And I'm wondering what your advice.
Bargaining, all of those feelings will be with people now who've lost their job. And my message to them would be to hold both, so that you allow yourself to experience the loss and adjust. But I mean, this isn't a short-term thing. This takes time for people to adjust. It's painful. And I'm sorry for anyone that happens to. I really am.
So I'm going to turn to the questions, and I can see from the comments. I think some of you've experienced a little bit of difficulty and some of it freezing, and I can see you saying that. I'm very sorry for that, but I'm sure it's been recorded. So if you've missed stuff, you can go back and rewatch.
That's so annoying. I'm so sorry.
I think it's just probably a few of you, but if you now have a question, also someone suggested Wim Hof while we were going along, but it's in your book. Cold water swimming, I think, is one of the most amazing. If you are lucky enough, or just a cold shower or bath, I also think is an amazing.
Any of the things that make your system wake up with the shock that feels like fear, but you survive it. So, I mean, I had a client in my book, Rachel, who went to the Hampstead pools. She was very, very anxious, and she decided to go to the Hampstead pools, and it transformed her because she felt brave. It was an amazing habit being in nature. And also there's something about the physiology of jumping in cold water kick-started her whole autonomic nervous system that reduced her anxiety. It was amazing.
So I'm just going to now open it up for questions. So if you type them where you've been typing them in the chat box, I would be very interested. I'll just go with the first one I can see. In hearing Julia's views on some of the most challenging discussions we need to be having with relatives, such as understanding their wishes if they become sick, and whether or not they want to stay at home. This is a huge concern and source of stress for this person who's asking, with an elderly and frail relative who's currently self-isolating.
I think that's such an important question, and I'm so glad that you asked it. I mean, I really believe we need to be having these conversations, and ideally before there's a crisis. Probably the most important thing is to be having the important conversations about what you feel about your parent or the person, your relative, or the person that you love, about, so that you don't have regrets of what you wish you'd said. That really matters. And asking them about their end of life wishes. But you could maybe start by talking about yourself. So even if you're the generation younger, all of us feel much more mortal right now. And if your parent is someone who finds talking about death and dying very difficult, that you could start exploring by saying, I've been thinking about what would happen to me and what I would want. If I became very ill, would I want to stay at home? Would I want to go into an intensive care unit and be on a ventilator? And my feeling is, for me, I'd rather stay at home. And so that you can have that kind of discussion with your parents, so that you do know. And actually having an advance directive that's signed will make what's already incredibly difficult much better. And I think one of the reasons people don't have those conversations is they have a kind of magical thinking that they think, if I talk or even think about death or think about the person that I love is going to die, somehow it will hasten their death. But actually, I think the person who your parent, who you're worrying about, they may well be worrying about them too, but don't want to upset you. And so there's a co-protection that can happen, that both of you are very aware and very worried about these things that are, right in our faces right now. So it's much, much better to be having those conversations. And my message is that we should examine death and dying as much as we examine life and living, and that the sooner we do it, the more confident we are when we come to face it, as all of us will.
A lot of people reacting to the conversation we were having about going back to a new normal and how we would go back to this.
What are they saying?
And the positives. So a lot of people are saying advice for people who are enjoying it, enjoying lockdown, and also people who are genuinely worried about readjusting, going back to reality. I think a lot of people were commenting and are commenting now in the questions about things like going back to a busy commute, and they're genuinely, that is a worry, which is interesting.
Well, I mean, if you have, so there's always re-entry problems. I mean, all of us, that thing of coming back from holiday, that thing when you land at the airport and you're going home and you've got to unpack your case, there is always a transition difficulty that we all face. And this is going to be intensified. It's going to be with the volume turned up. So in some ways, all the coping mechanisms and self-support that I talk about to use when you're in lockdown, use as much or not more when you transition, but also be mindful. Like really think, talk to, I don't believe that people's bosses aren't going to be thinking more about home working, and that it'll be very useful to go into work and discuss and be honest at work about the transition. I think the more people get above the waterline, that people say what's on their minds to the people they're working with, that they're transparent, then you build stronger relationships and you feel more robust in making the decisions that you're doing, but also you feel more confident in the transition.
And I think this one, I'm sure, applies to so many people. It's about, again, we touched on it briefly, but advice for living in the moment. This person says that they just have an unhealthy fixation on planning and living in the future. I'm sure there are a lot of people who do, and therefore find it very hard when their future is unknown. So they're asking for your more advice on that being able to live in the moment.
I think it's really good to know that, first of all, that you know that you find that difficult. It's much harder for people who don't even realize it. So you have a level of awareness that's really good. One of the mechanisms I use a lot with people is if you imagine in your mind a television screen and you put the picture on it of your uncertain future, and then you take a breath. So you close your eyes, put the picture on it of your uncertain future, take a breath, switch the channel and put it on to a safe place, a kind of happy place, maybe a beach, maybe the top of a mountain, maybe your favorite garden, and then take a breath and then move your attention to what you're doing in the day. That really works at lowering your anxiety and stops you projecting into the future. And we're habit making beings. We develop by making habits. The more you do it, the more powerful it is and the more effective it will be.
I'm going to read, very sad, I'm sorry to read it, but I'm sure there are other people out there with the same situations. But someone says that they lost their grandmother on Sunday and their other grandmother 8 months ago. Firstly, I'm very sorry for you. But they say they're very grateful for your talk. I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety. Do you have any advice for navigating my feelings of grief during this time of uncertainty?
Well, first, like Hannah, to say I'm so sorry. That's an awful lot of loss very close to each other. And I think the experiencing a bereavement in the time of Corona, it will be intensified, your feeling of loss. And I think grief does feel like fear anyway. So that what you're feeling, as difficult as it is, let yourself know that it's normal. I hope you have people that are close to that you can talk to. I hope you have ways that you can find of expressing how you feel. That may be tears, it may be anger, but ways to support yourself. And I think one of the big important things to remember is that in grief, it's a twofold thing. One is to face the reality of the loss, to recognize and grieve the fact that your grandmother has died. But the other is that the love you feel for her never dies. And so that lives on. And having touchstones to her memory, whether it's looking at photographs of her, whether it's wearing a scarf of hers, whether it's making her favorite cottage pie or walking where she walked, that you connect with her, that she will always stay with you. And actually, if you asked her a question in your mind, you would probably know the answer, so that people keep that dialogue going. What it's called in the trade is continuing bonds, that the relationship doesn't die, although the person has died. I hope that's a helpful thought.
And I'm going to just move on to another question, which is someone who says they work with key workers and wondered if you had tips to keep my team motivated during these times of crisis when people are anxious about themselves, but also trying to support their clients through the crisis.
That's another very good question. I think dark humor really helps. I think most of people who work in the NHS, and because I worked in the NHS for 25 years, they do both. They're used to kind of being operative and being on and being very goal directed. And when they feel themselves feeling very nervous, they get super busy. And I think one of the things that really helps calm them is black humor, is sort of telling jokes or sending, there are masses of things online now of sort of funny stories. What I've done with the team I'm working with is that I've given them a 3-minute relaxation that they've got in their phone, and it's a very simple one where they scrunch up really, really tight and squeeze everything, close their eyes, and then they breathe in for 7 and out for 11 for 3 minutes, and that winds their whole system down, and it expands their emotional availability. I've used it for years with doctors and nurses and midwives, and it's incredibly effective. If you email How to Academy, I can send it to you.
If I know that, as I mentioned, your book is hugely based, and you've said it, on the importance of relationships. So I thought this person says that for those, and I'm sure there are many in long distance, and I'm sure feeling the same things, not even in long distance, but those in long distance relationships, isolating in different places. One of them is an NHS worker. How can we keep everything hopeful?
I think it's tough. I mean, I think you must also be on different shifts, so it's hard to see each other. I think keep it in the day that you look forward to the times that you do speak. I think you can do sweet things for each other, like send each other little playlists, or even send each other postcards so that you can surprise each other. I think you can make sure that you kind of go back and remember the times that you're together, and that will ignite the hope that what it's going to be like when you're together next time. Those are the things I can think of now. Also, I think doing stuff together, like watching a film at the same time, even if you're in different places, or listening to music at the same time. And you can accompany each other, can't you, through supper, doing all sorts of things, so that you kind of feel connected. And I think that gives you hope too.
A lot of people are asking about, obviously at this time, many people have their children at home, and there's advice about keeping them upbeat and also homeschooling. How you advise them?
I think for all of this, one of the things is to give yourself a break, that you're never going to be the perfect parent right now. And all of you are going to have a difficult time. Your children are not going to be upbeat all the time. And it's not possible for you to be upbeat and keep them upbeat. So I think it's being realistic about what your expectations are, that you can do fun things together, you can play things together. But also a lot of them, it depends how old they are, but the teenagers I've spoken to or heard about feel absolutely crushed that they're not doing their A-levels or not going on their gap years. They're not having any sex. They're not they're not dating. They're not out exploring in the way that they expected and wanted to. And that is another living loss. That is a loss. So I would do a kind of mixture. I'd have that Cobra meeting. I would have some plans that you can do fun stuff together. I wouldn't be too military police about how much screen time they have. I'd let them have time with their friends and don't kind of police it, because they need to talk to their friends. So let them do it. And in some ways, let them have treats they don't normally have. And it can't do them that harm in a sort of limited time. I spoke to a specialist on it and she told me. So this comes from the horse's mouth. And I think the big thing is self-compassion, like give yourself a break. And then
I'm really interested in this person's question. They say, I'm worried about after lockdown what will happen to our reactions and our connections with other people. Will it be different? Will we have a fear that we might think, shall I talk to them, or do they have it? It's very interesting.
Like everyone's a walking pathogen.
So will we be able to go back to hugging and being connected to people as we once were? I think that's a fear that a lot of people have. We've lost this sense of connection. Will we always feel we have to keep a 2-meter distance?
I think it's really interesting. So my first book, Grief Works, was published in China, and I did a webinar in China in March, and there was and it was just as lockdown was being lifted. And there was this, I don't know if it's different in the culture in China, but there was this enormous sense of distrust of anyone walking towards you, and everyone was still wearing masks and gloves. And so there was fear. My my kind of feeling is that the levels of anxiety and will be there at the beginning, but as there's a vaccine and as we kind of understand the virus more, we'll trust more, and then we will be able to go back to how we've been before. But I don't know if other people know, like when I see films now where people just rush up to each other and hug each other, I get this pang, like, oh my God. Or I see people walking in the street.
Yeah,
I have this unbelievable kind of like, oof, that's, one thing is for sure, I am bloody well going to be doing that, because I just know I will.
someone asks about the role of faith for people at the moment. I know that it's very hard. I mean, churches, places of worship are closed. That's a place that people would have flocked to if they could have in times of crisis. It's very hard. People having to practice their faith alone when they can't be in communities. What's your advice for them? And I'm sure it shakes faith in many ways as well.
I mean, I don't have advice. I mean, what I do know is that those that have faith have less fear about death. And so they may be slightly less fearful now because they have a belief system of going to a better place, and they have faith in God that is a kind of good God and a loving God. So that supports them. Some people, when terrible things happen, like someone may have had a terrible thing happen who had faith, may lose their faith through COVID because it doesn't make any sense to them anymore to believe in God. What I think, along with the Serenity Prayer, is that hope is connected to kind of trusting there's that we're not in charge, that there's some higher power, whether it's nature or Gaia or something. I think people do turn to that. I mean, the majority of people, whether they are practicing a religion or not, when something bad happens, they pray. Most people pray. If their husband is incredibly ill and they're in intensive care, people pray. So I think we want to believe that there is some benign force that's on our side. And I think the big thing really that it's saying is that we want to be able to trust, and we want to be able to believe that good things will come through.
It's a little similar to the relationship question, but I think this applies more to people who are, talking about relations inside their home.
Yeah. I mean, there's more divorce requests already.
So how can we be better partners, they say, during lockdown?
I mean, like I said before, I think your pre-existing fault lines and your pre-existing difficulties will be exposed during lockdown. And also they'll be intensified during lockdown, because if you're like us, you're fighting over bandwidth, you're fighting over rooms, all of you are kind of competing for space, and all of us are kind of more anxious than normal. So I think one of the good things about this idea of a Cobra meeting is talking to each other, maybe just as a couple, and being honest about what your tendencies are. So I know I get quite sort of, I get shut down when I'm worried. And that isn't very helpful. Because, if someone asks me what I'm feeling, I kind of, as a therapist, I don't have the best response. I do eventually say everything, but it takes a time. So I think give yourself and your partner time. If you can, I think walking and talking is the most effective way of being honest with each other. So even if you've got your 1 hour that you're allowed out, I'd go and walk and talk together, because you're not eyeballing each other, and you can look at the ground and you can have a bit of space. So I think owning what you're likely to be feeling, letting them own what they're feeling, looking at what the crossfire is, where the difficulties are, and kind of agreeing a truce. Like, for this time, let's try not to have that fight, that we always have about sex or money or whatever the things are, so that we turn up the volume on being a bit kinder to each other, so that we can do it without killing each other, basically.
And someone says, and I have absolutely no doubt, again, that they speak for very many people, how do you manage the lack of human touch? I don't live with anybody, so I miss hugs.
I wish I had an answer. I don't have one. I mean, I think screen connection is the next best thing, but it is not the same as a hug. I really get that. I don't know whether to suggest masturbating. I have no idea. Maybe that helps. It could well, but that's the only thing I can come up with is toys and masturbating.
I'm not sure there's a.
I think Esther Perel would agree with me.
People say, are we able to continue? How are we able to continue being more open in the way we are now? People are talking and connecting in a way. I think that's true. I think I said before, and we spoke about a lack of shame, and we were getting there in modern society. There's definitely people share a lot more, but through this, there's a lot of openness and sharing about feelings. And that person says, how can we continue being more open like that?
I think it's a decision. And I think it's also, I mean, one of the things I say in my book is that for relationships, you know, having a strong love relationship and all relationships are a predictor of good outcomes in your life, that you're healthier, you're wealthier, you're happier, your memory is better in old age, you have less pain in old age. But that means you have to give them a priority. And so if you give your work and busyness the priority, you're not going to be having those conversations. So really, you have to decide, am I going to drop something in order to make space to feel close to people, to have those conversations, if I wasn't having them before? And look at what was blocking them before. Maybe it wasn't a time thing. Maybe it was that you were scared, and now that you've done it and you've seen that you're accepted and known as you are, which is one of the great kind of joys in life of being authentic, is that how you feel yourself to be on the inside is what you show on the outside, and it's what people receive, is an enormous confidence builder. And if that is happening for you, then you kind of keep on doing it, babe.
Someone responded to the question of needing a hug a tree. I think nature and going outdoors can perhaps be one of, they're perhaps hugging a tree. A lot of people are saying they like that response. This one is actually, I think, very relevant to you, because again, as I said, you talk about a lot about relationships, and you talk a lot in your book about relationships in the modern day, and online dating and how things are not as they used to be. But what is your advice, somebody says, on potentially starting new relationships during isolation with video dating? Does this potentially exacerbate stress and anxiety? Should we be patient and focus on ourselves?
Oh, blimey, I don't know. I think if you find a new relationship, whether it's online through COVID, trust your instincts, kind of listen to yourself. I wouldn't kind of get your brain to think I shouldn't be doing this. I think if it's meeting some need in you and it's the sort of person you've been looking for, just go slowly. That's the thing. I mean, I don't imagine yourself kind of committing, because, you know, you need to meet each other and smell each other and know what it's like actually being with each other. But I think it's a very nice way of meeting if you've got all these weeks to have all the conversations that some people don't leave until after they've committed, and then it's too late.
I'm moving all over the place, but there's no rhyme or reason to the questions that are coming up on my screen. But somebody asked, and I'm sure lots of people would like to know this too, we mentioned key workers, but specifically advice for working with NHS staff at the moment. And I think this person is referring to the fact that lots of us being asked to be volunteers. So going in to work with NHS staff, what would be your advice to them?
Well, I don't quite know what the question is. The question about how you protect yourself from the infection? Is it about how you
working amongst and with NHS staff at the moment?
I mean, it's a great thing to be doing. Make sure that you're protecting yourself properly. And I think that the NHS staff are really appreciating the voluntary help, but also get them to, you can't be expected to know everything. So get them to tell you what you need and what you're doing, and so that you can feel confident about the tasks that are set you. Most of them, I can think, are quite kind of straightforward tasks, aren't they? I think that's all I can think of. Is there something specific they want?
No, I think a few people are asking, of course, it's a very difficult time for NHS staff, living with NHS staff, working with them under their particular pressures. So I think it was mainly to do to do
And I
with that.
think, so when I work with them every week. I get them to tell me how they're feeling. They always make a joke, and I acknowledge how fantastic they are and what they're doing and how much I appreciate it. And I think they really feel that being acknowledged, I think, really gives them a boost. So I would do that too.
Julia, there's so many people saying thank you very, very much. There's also plentiful advice coming in, so I hope that perhaps you can all see and looking at the chat's comments alongside, and I think that very many people would love the advice that you offered, so we'll get them to sort that out and to email in.
And they can find it in my book, hopefully.
I think I've got time just for the very, very one last question that's just popped in, because I think it's interesting. Working with vulnerable people and offering telephone support, any suggestions how to end a session as conscious they are immediately back to their lives and have no time to de-stress? I think it's a very good point. Many people are over the phone trying to support vulnerable people. Just a couple of minutes.
I normally, if I'm doing that, I'd call the 5-minute bell before the end. So I'd say, so we've got 5 minutes before the end. I'm just wanting to check, maybe should we do a breathing exercise for a few minutes, wanting to check what you're going to do when you're finished on the phone with me. Are you okay? Is there anything we need to be thinking about? Make sure that you tell them when you're next going to speak and connect. You know, and if there's a lot that you're worried about, do it 10 minutes before the end, so that you really give it an ending.
Julia, thank you so very much. I could go on for another hour at least, but our time in the virtual webinar is up. Thank you all who are still out there. I think all of you are, for joining us. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope I meet you in real life one day.